Welcome, everyone, to this month's Spirituality and Health seminar. Today, we are just so fortunate to have Jennifer Wortham to give us a talk on adverse childhood experiences and moral injury. So Dr. Wortham is a religion, spirituality, and forgiveness research associate for the Harvard program on human flourishing. She earned her doctorate in public health at UCLA, Fielding School of Public Health, and she teaches graduate level courses in health services, quality management, and patient safety methods there at UCLA. She has extensive experience in health system transformation, and she has served as a strategy and population health consultant for leading healthcare organizations in the public and private sectors for over 30 years. Dr. Wortham's current research focuses on the impact of moral and spiritual injury on health outcomes, and she is leading an international research project on the development of psychosocial spiritual interventions for victims of moral injury. She authored a memoir on forgiveness titled A Letter to the Pope, The Keeper of the Nest, based on her family's experience with clergy abuse. And she is leading a survivor-led coalition focused on the establishment of a United Nations World Day for the Protection of Child Dignity, which she just informs me was approved. So hopefully, Jennifer, you'll say a few words about that. But other than that, Jennifer is a very close friend and colleague of mine, and we've worked together for about 5 years, and really some exciting things that we're doing together and planning to do together. But she's going to really focus on the adverse childhood experiences and how they relate to moral injury during adulthood. Okay, Jennifer, take it away.
Harold, thank you. So yes, very happy and delighted to be here. And thank you again, Harold, for the invitation and just the great mentoring and support I've had from you over the years. I'm going to turn off my video for a few minutes because it looks like I'm getting some internet challenges. So I'll join you guys back and forth in a few minutes. I want to make sure we don't get disrupted. But yes, I have been working on the issue of ACEs and particularly child sexual abuse for the last 5 years. And I put together a global collaborative to pursue a World Day at the United Nations. And that was actually approved in November of 2022. Last year, we had the first year commemoration, and got to spend time in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone was the member state that carried the motion for us at the United Nations. And so I've been steeped in this work, and along the way, realized that child abuse was an egregious moral injury. And so I got introduced to Harold, and when I was wanting to explore the victims aspect of moral injury. And we hit it off and have been working collaboratively since then. Also, as an update, we together with the program at the Human Flourishing Program team prepared a proposal to the APA to include moral problems in the DSM, and that is moving along very well. We have approval from the committees, so it's going to go to the APA General Assembly, we hope this fall, and that will be a significant advancement in the field of moral injury because now it will become part of the Z code, the religion and spiritual Z code, which allows, of course, us to do a lot more research and over the years, hopefully, eventually present moral injury disorder as a distinct disorder. But Harold co-led that work with me, and we had lots of great discussions and had an amazing team, and that work has been successful. And many thanks again, Harold, for your guidance in that endeavor as well. So lots to talk about in moral injury. I will let all of you know I had a serious death in the family last week, so I'm a little off my game. I did my best on the presentation. Also ended up with bronchitis, so a few of my slides are not exactly what I wanted them to be, but nevertheless, we're going to go over ACEs and moral injury today, and then if there's any questions, we'll go ahead and have some time for that as well. All right. Thank you. Okay. See. All right. Well, welcome. So the Human Flourishing Program, for those of you who are not aware, is a program at Harvard focused on bringing together the quantitative and social sciences. And it was founded by, or co-founded by, Tyler Vanderwill, who is an epidemiologist and biostatistician who really felt that there was not a good segue between the two sciences. How do we take all this amazing data and epi and biostats and bring it to disciplines such as, theology and sociology? And so we have a very comprehensive program with about 23 different scholars involved now, in some direct way, and doing extensive research on various elements of human flourishing. We launched the Global Flourishing Study. Last year was the launch with Gallup and Baylor, and we just got the first round of data 3 or 4 months ago, and soon to get the second round of data. That program is a study that's looking at over 20 different countries and applying a comprehensive flourishing survey to identify the different aspects of flourishing from different cultural perspectives, religious perspectives, different national perspectives. And so that's the bulk of our work right now. My work in the program, I'm focusing on suffering and adversity, primarily around ACEs and moral injury, and have the blessing to be able to work with such an amazing team of people from around the world, and really learning a lot myself, and hopefully bringing more to the academy over the next 2 years. Um, so I'm going to talk today about how flourishing affects how ACEs affects one's state of flourishing. And I'm going to go in depth into what ACEs is for those of you who are not familiar, and some of the challenges with ACEs. And then I'm connecting it to moral injury. There's a lot more work to be done. There's not a lot of research on ACEs as a moral injury. And so we're launching several studies, and looking for people who want to collaborate with us as well. So if there's an interest, at the end, you can let me know. So ACEs is an adverse childhood experience that occurs before the age of 18. There's a number of different criteria that denote something as an ACE. And I have, at the end of my presentation, I have an ACE survey tool that is the standard tool that's used across industry. The ACEs has now become a significant issue in healthcare research and public health, especially. And I'll go into the details in a little bit, but just to give you an idea of the scope or scale of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences is not uncommon. 64% of the population has at least one type of ACE. But what's the most important is the number of ACEs, because the number of ACEs somebody has indicates long-term potential adverse health outcomes. And so 17% of the population in the US has 4 or more types of ACEs. And that's significant. And I could spend, a whole week talking about ACEs. If you want to Google ACEs, you'll see there's just a tremendous amount of research now on ACEs. And I'll talk to you why the 4 or more is very important. So since we're considered a stressful or traumatic event, of course, it happens before the age of 18. There's a scale that's commonly used now that has 10 items on it. The items range from physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, to experiences of highly stressful events in the child's life, including separation or divorce of parents, a parent with a history of mental health issues or addiction, or a parent who was incarcerated. And so what they do is they look at this as a whole. Um, the way most of the data is reported is the number of ACEs that the individual recalls, by category, not by number of incidents. And so the research that's been done is pretty profound. The first research was done by Kaiser Permanente, and actually had the advantage of working for Kaiser in the 2000s, and this was a big deal at Kaiser. There was a physician, a medical director in San Diego, who was working closely with. They had a weight loss clinic, or it was for weight management for patients that were struggling with obesity, and they noticed a trend of dropouts, especially among women, and they delved deep and they found an interesting correlation. The women that were dropping out had a history of child abuse, particularly child sexual abuse. And it was enough of uh, an associate. The statistics were enough that basically he's like decided to delve deeper into the topic of sexual abuse and how it was impacting those patients' health and obesity in general. And they published a study, and it was pretty profound. And so the CDC learned about it, and because Kaiser had a longitudinal history of patient data because of their early intervention into medical records, they were able to do very large studies. And so they did a study of about 20,000 members where they had full medical records, and so, many years of medical records and history. And so they created the ACE survey tool, and with the CDC did a study, and it was I would say in public health, it's probably one of the seminal events in public health and that we've ever experienced, because the association with adverse child experiences and long-term health outcomes was so profound. And it was not only behavioral and mental health issues, but it was chronic health issues. And so that was done by Folletti et al. And it's a really interesting study. And since then, there's been many more uh, studies, and there's many states have implemented large annual surveys that they do. California recently implemented something called ACEs Aware. It mandates now that all Medicaid providers do an ACE screening. And It's because it's been that much of an issue in terms of its predictive ability for adverse health outcomes. So what they found, and then there's been a lot of research. Harvard implemented something called the Childhood Lab, the Center for Childhood Development, and they found that exposure to frequent adversity in childhood without mediating factors, in other words, a supportive parent or adult. There's some evidence as well as, if individuals had a connection to religious communities, it can dysregulate the child's stress response and lead to a condition known as toxic stress. And this toxic stress occurs where the child just can't turn off the stress response. And as we all know now, stress has a significant impact on the development of many health conditions. But it also has a significant impact on the brain. And I'm gonna share with you some slides, just a select few slides. As I said, I could talk about this for a week straight and still not be finished. So toxic stress impacts memory, selective attention, self-control, and it really inhibits the child's ability to explore and learn from their environment. So it impacts their ability to engage in their relationships. And it becomes embedded traits as the child is developing. So, and then there's also epigenetic factors tied to this. So we see this repeating from an intergenerational standpoint, which is pretty significant. So the study findings, they found that a male child with an ACE score of 6 or more, in other words, if you had 6 types of adversities, had a 4,600% increase in the likelihood of later using intravenous drugs. And then in self-described depression, an individual with an ACE score of 4 or more was 460% more likely to be depressed. So there was just a significant correlation with adverse health outcomes. Also, a significant increase in attempted suicide, and um, the suicide association is profound because it's one of the highest correlations that is really been found. And there's some specific ACEs that tend to have a higher rates of suicide, but if you just look in general, with the dose response relationship, attempted suicide is increased significantly with higher ACEs. So another study found that, along with suicidal ideation and suicide attempts, increased in adulthood from 1.4 to 2.7 times. So this is just an example of the types of adverse mental health outcomes that individuals experience. And so you can see intravenous drug use, moderate to heavy drinking, depressed effect, suicide attempts. So there's many studies, but this one I wanted to share. Melissa Merrick is the president of Prevent Child Abuse America. She worked for the CDC and has done extensive research, and now runs Prevent Child Abuse America and focuses a lot of her time and attention on helping to increase awareness of ACEs, because of the dramatic impact it has on so many aspects of individuals' lives. So I talked a little bit about ACEs and toxic stress. So what they found is that children who don't have time to compress and those lacking supportive structures develop this syndrome of toxic stress, and it actually prevails throughout the lifetime, because once the stress pathways and change, and I'll go through a little bit more details. It's very difficult for people to turn off even in adulthood, and so individuals end up with PTSD and a long-term challenges with managing anxiety, and that just is compounded because they end up in also higher toxic environments because of their histories. And so it's a profound issue. So just to give you an idea, this came from a study on psychosis, but if you put impact on the brain of stress, this particular slide shows up on Google about 100 times. So they looked at MRIs and have done a lot of different testing in the brains of individuals, and this one was just so profound. So it shows the healthy brain and the brain that's impacted by the toxic stress, and so as you can see, it's a pretty profound difference. And I'll go through the study that came from the study I listed here, the authors of all of the different studies. But this is from the same study, and what they did is they showed a lifetime, basically stress vulnerability model, where individuals have significant symptoms related to their stress. And you can, for those of you who are physicians, can see how the stress impacts the different, hormones and stress hormones, and it becomes like this vicious cycle. And so one of the challenges is, of course, that long-term chronic stress can lead to development of things like Alzheimer's disease, and so pretty significant from the what we say the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. The individuals that are really struggle with the stress response. And for those of you who are familiar with trauma, when an individual has a significant amount of trauma in childhood, then they develop trigger. They basically have triggers, things that trigger the stress response, even in adulthood, even when things may not be perceived initially as danger. The triggers cause them to have this cascade of events that happen, and so it's a profound issue for them, and challenging to treat, because when you think of PTSD, typically you get exposed to one event or as an adult, you can address the one event, but these children are in this environment of constant violence and constant adversity, and so it's a complex issue to treat. This also, the slide indicates, the kind of cycle, and so we do see that individuals that have this higher stress response have kind of a genetic vulnerability, but there's also epigenetics involved. And so I have a couple of slides I will share about that as well. But what the same study found is that individuals exposed to the trauma have this altered development trajectory, have other psychotic-like experiences, and this increases their vulnerability to being traumatized in other ways and being in toxic environments, and it just becomes this cycle. This one, psychosis, is not as common as many of the other disorders that individuals with ACEs experience, but this particular study I thought was just really a great way of illustrating how all these dynamics interact, and it's probably one of the more severe sides of the spectrum of what happens, but it's a very important view so that people can understand the gravity of what happens with ACEs. So the impact of toxic stress in untreated adults, and so these symptoms can range from mild to moderate to basically be subclinical to full on complex PTSD. Many people are not diagnosed until later in life, and so they may get in their 40s and 50s, typically after a triggering event. And so they have to navigate and manage a lot of challenges. And I gave this presentation to the Army in January, and that they have a segment of their population that struggles with emotional regulation, and they have a high suicide rate, and they're not screening for ACEs when personnel come in, service personnel enlist, and so we're working with them now on the development of some programs so that they can do some earlier screening and identify individuals that are at risk, so that they can create some interventions so that individuals will start to understand what their triggers are and then how to mitigate their stress, and that it could be life-changing for many of these guys that are coming in, 17, 18 years old, who, they've got some behavioral patterns that are well established, but opportunities for them to make adjustments and not have to deal with, all of the fallout of their inability to control or regulate their behaviors. So we're real excited about that work. So this is just some examples of individuals that have issues with emotional regulation. So they can have intense bouts of anger. There's a lot of emotional instability, difficulty coping with stress, self-destructive behaviors, difficulty forming and maintaining relationships. So that is a result of the challenges with trust. But the emotional dysregulation, those things are all neurological, and again can be triggered, but and I'm not a physician, so I didn't want to get into the slide to have to answer a lot of questions, but there actually is anatomical changes in the brain with individuals that have this toxic stress impact, and so and there's many, and so and it's very complex, and they're still trying to unpack everything, but it is pretty profound, and so those that have exposure, especially as the younger children when they're still developing, really do have disabilities, and many of them are not diagnosed with disabilities, so they're just diagnosed with behavioral problems, and they're being challenged in school. Other folks go into the kind of opposite realm of expression. They get into emotional numbing, and impulsivity is common, difficulty expressing emotions, hypervigilance, and then avoidance of emotions. And so these are all common things for people with ACEs and history of trauma. And of course, these types of behaviors and challenges impact individuals over the entire life course, and it can be very confusing for them, and very stigmatizing as well. So lots to unpack. So then there's the course we call the moral and spiritual dimension of ACEs and trauma. And trauma extends far beyond the physical and mental dimensions. So it does include a moral and spiritual dimension. And individuals that experience abuse, based on the type of abuse it is, there's a lot of complexity around trust and relationship with God, and feeling potentially punished, or feeling that God doesn't love them, wondering, why God isn't allowing something to happen. Um, and so those things manifest, and so it can impact their spiritual formation. And throughout life, they can go through different points in time where they have existential crisis. And so we one of the big challenges we see in as you all know, probably in your practice in healthcare, or in mental health, that the spiritual and moral dimensions of trauma are often neglected. And so they want to treat it just from a psychological perspective. But in my own life, I have a very high ACE score. I've found that the religious and spiritual connection is actually what helps me the most. Um, and there's a lot of evidence around different types of practices, mindfulness, meditation, that have a significant impact for people that are struggling with the long-term effects of ACEs. And so, and when we think about meaning and purpose and helping people to reconnect, these are all things that are really important elements, and things that we need to address. And so, moral injury, as we've defined it now in our treatment program, is persistent distress that arises from a personal experience that disrupts or threatens one's sense of goodness of oneself, of others, of institutions, or what it believed or understood to be higher powers. And so, and we also look at about what is right and wrong, or good and evil. And so the traditional view of moral injury has really focused on the perpetration and witnessing of morally injurious events. When I first started working with Harold, we delved deeper into what's the victim experience of moral injury. And we're still unpacking a bit on what all of these different elements are called, because most people perceive moral injury as something that you perpetrate. But betrayal and witnessing and experiencing betrayal are significant elements of how people perceive, um, what is just and what is moral. And so the children that are exposed to different forms of abuse, and have significant betrayal, it really alters their sense of safety and security in the world, and their sense of connection to God. And so, and then one of the challenges, which is it becomes a vicious cycle, is that ACEs result in maladaptive behavior. Maladaptive behavior includes, you know, um, high risk sexual behaviors, alcohol and drug problems. Those alcohol and drug problems cause them to do a lot of things that they feel, maybe experience a lot of guilt and remorse about. Um, and it becomes this cycle. And so when we think about the extent of moral injury, it's a very complex moral injury, and that's not been really yet described in the literature. But how does somebody who is, abused, severely abused, or abused as a child, and develops this, you know, more aggressive, fight mode of dealing with their challenges, is in wanting deeper levels of control. And if they perpetrate, then now they're dealing with the guilt of perpetrating, but also the victimization, and it just becomes this vicious cycle. So not a lot of research has been done on that, but I think that it merits a deeper look, and how we look at complex moral injury. There have been some research that ties a history of child abuse to a higher rate of moral injury and PTSD in adults that are exposed to potentially morally injurious events. And so I've only found a couple of studies so far that have looked at different populations, again, wanting to do more research. but so my hypothesis is, people get exposed to a potentially morally unjust event. It's a triggering event, and then they get very preoccupied with the issues that they have that are unresolved from that childhood trauma. And so when we think about soldiers, in the field, everybody that goes to war experiences it in a different way. And many cope. They have some challenges, but many can cope with it. And then others, have significant issues with drinking, with sleep, and ultimately developing PTSD and moral injury. And so some of this early research is indicating that there is a connection when you have had childhood adversity, and again, believing that it's a trigger. So they've looked at public safety personnel and armed forces, Canadian Armed Forces. Study was very interesting. And I've anecdotally heard of challenges amongst healthcare providers, many that the Adventist health system. I haven't seen the research, but they did a study in California in preparation for the ACEs Aware program. They wanted to look at their own personnel, and they were really surprised at the high number of ACEs that their healthcare personnel had. And so they spent the first year just focused on their own providers, and realizing that many of them that were dealing with the challenges of COVID and burnout and other things had histories of ACEs. And so that this was really a retriggering. So hopefully much more research to follow on this, but again, very important correlations. So as you think about religious and spiritual practices that improve stress and trauma adaptability, it's very similar to what many of you have been exposed to. So we know there are many religious frameworks that help to contextualize experiences, including stressful events in childhood. And so we see that religion and spiritual practice improve meaning in life, and that has been shown to mitigate the adverse effects of stress. Um, Spiritual practices, of course, such as prayer, meditation, enhanced support, which is a critical factor. I didn't get all of these cited. I wanted to, but we know Harold's work well. There's a lot of great work that they've done in looking at the different ways that religion and spirituality supports healing. Um, and so when we look at protective factors, many parents who had high ACEs because of their maladaptive coping, and their exposure to dysfunctional parenting, they continue the cycle. And so a significant amount of work is being done in California around training parents how to reduce uh, how to reduce the effects of their own abuse on their children. And so protective factors, even if the environment is challenging, the protective factors by having a supportive parent and or supportive adult in the child's life has been shown to be a buffer that can help reduce the toxic stress that they experience. And so they look at things like a healthy culture. And so for adults, of course, that would be like a supportive work environment. But for children, it would be a supportive school environment, positive and supportive peer network, resilience training, diet, exercise, sleep, mindfulness. But religious service attendance and spiritual practices is also a significant buffer for children that are experiencing adversity, and then for adults that are looking to heal. And so, again, there's just, as I would say, we have to draw these conclusions from a variety of studies. I don't know of a specific study that has looked over time at individuals with ACEs and religious service attendants. There's kind of short-term studies that will show somebody did an intervention for 6 weeks and how it might impact. But my my strong belief on everything that I've learned and read over the years is that over time, having a strong practice and having the ability to rely on your religious framework to contextualize um, abuse is a significant factor in better health outcomes. So there is work done on the different approaches for healing, and and individuals with complex PTSD and high ACEs need a multidisciplinary approach with psychological care, social services support, peer support and counselors, restorative justice, which is a practice we're seeing a lot in the child sexual abuse space, and then pastoral or spiritual care. And again, we don't see a lot of spiritual care that's integrated into mental health. So one of the programs I'm working on is how we can integrate spiritual care. And we just did a program in March called it was basically healing approaches for individuals with moral injury and trauma, and more to follow on that. That all that information is still accessible. We have a website if you're interested. Harold was one of our keynotes, and but we had many great speakers on these topics. Other pathways to healing for survivors. So, of course, traditional cognitive processing therapy has some benefit, but it has mixed results. There's a therapy called rapid eye movement therapy, and that has promise. I've spoken with many I was at a first responder conference a couple of weeks ago in Connecticut, and one of the speakers was talking about EMDR, and several of the first responders had gone through that therapy. There had been a really serious shooting that several first responders were involved with, and they got up and spoke and talked about the impact of EMDR on their outcomes was pretty profound. Restorative justice and reconciliation is been shown to have significant value. Of course, support groups, self-care, mindfulness, those elements cannot be underscored. And many children that experience abuse struggle with setting boundaries. So there's a lot of work that's done on how they can reset boundaries. Of course, educating yourself and gaining awareness about the impact of ACEs, and being able to develop even compassion for parents who may have contributed to the abuseful environment because of the intergenerational impact is important. And when we look at forgiveness, was a significant element of that because many adults harbor a lot of anger and resentment, and so helping to educate them on the cycle of violence and the generational cycle of ACEs is important. Building, of course, supportive relationships, meaning and purpose is significant contribution, and then working on self-image. And so these are just some pathways to healing that's noted in the literature, and dealing with individuals with high levels of trauma. So some additional resources. Harold had worked with the VA, and he led the development of the religious and spiritual cognitive processing therapy. And I know he has it published in multiple places, but one of the books that is used now by military chaplains is called Moral Injury, a Handbook for Military Chaplains, and he outlines that therapy there, and it's a really wonderful 12 module program on dealing with everything, and I'll let Harold expand a little bit on it, but dealing with everything from self-loathing into God's love, and it's been written in 5 languages. I don't know, Harold, do you want to share a little bit more about that therapy you developed?
Sure, Jennifer. Yes, we have a spiritually integrated cognitive processing therapy that's available in 5 different religions: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. And Michelle Pierce kind of led that effort to develop those interventions. We also have 5 pastoral care interventions focusing again on those 5 different religions, looking at moral injury and how would chaplains and clergy address it. So you can send me an email if you want to know more information. Happy to send you more information about that.
Thank you, Rob. And then Everett Worthington, who is an associate with our program, and he's an emeritus professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, has developed a program called Reach Forgiveness, and that is has extensive empirical evidence to support the outcomes of that is very positive. Of course, mindfulness resources. We're working now with James Gordon at the Mind Body Institute, and they have developed several programs that are used now throughout the VA. And then there's a couple other resources that I became aware of recently. David Burns has got a really great book called Feeling Good about addressing sadness and mild depression. David Rosmarin's done a tremendous amount of work on addressing anxiety. And of course, anxiety can be beneficial in many contexts, but for individuals with a history of ACEs is not all that helpful because it's again part of that cycle of stress that you just have to deal with throughout your life. And then there's a lot of work on the positive psychology side from Seligman on character strengths. Ty Abershede is another associate of our program, and he's got several programs around that as well. So those are some great resources. Let's see if I can. Okay, so questions now. I'll do my best.
Okay, so Jennifer, what a terrific presentation. Thank you so much. So let's take advantage of the wealth of information that Dr. Wortham has presented here, and let's have a bit of a dialogue. And just to raise your hand or unmute yourself or both and ask your question.
Joyce, I see your hand up.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this, all this good information and research. I was wondering, when you talked about your work in working with the military, I was wondering how can ACEs, how can learning about those childhood experiences in screening I can see how they can be helpful, and I'm wondering what kinds of safeguards can be put in place or should be put in place to prevent that kind of information from harming the people we're trying to help.
So we're just getting started with the discussions with them, and so the idea will be that we will be working with the chaplaincy corps, and so that that the ACEs information would not necessarily become part of their service record, but it would be an opportunity to build a trusting relationship with the chaplains. But there needs to be a significant amount of education that needs to be done. So we're just starting this dialogue, but it's really important information, and it's important information for people to understand what an ACE is, and for them to be mindful of their own, behaviors around, how they're dealing with stress, and how they've dealt with their childhood stress, and they may not be aware even that they most people don't tie their behaviors or their compensating factors with their ACEs. But I will also say that individuals ACEs have also developed some amazing skills, compensating skills. And so they need to understand that they can be really, really, really successful in some areas of their lives, and then in other areas of their lives really struggle. But the impact on their relationships and how they engage with people, At some point, those things do need to be addressed. And there's a very high number of enlisted that have a high number of ACEs. So it's a problem. It's something. Last year they had, it looks like, the highest year of suicide on record, and they've tried everything. And when they got to me, that was something that I had asked if they were screening, because one would assume that the pool that they're pulling from would have a high number of ACEs, and it's not been part of their programming. So a lot of work to be done, though. Yeah. Lee, I see your hand up.
Lee Burke, you're up next.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. Great presentation. Incredible work, both you and Harold. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I saw somebody raise the question in your presentation in the chat box
The
about.
chats. I haven't even looked at the chats yet.
Yeah, I know. It's hard to watch three things with two eyes. So the question that was raised, what I guess I'll use my phraseology. Is there an efficacy or benefit of the therapeutic effects of the arts, for example? And arts is a multiplicity. And has anybody looked at that? Is there any value? Again, I'll use the word efficacy of the arts doing a semblance of a reset. Our brains like a reset periodically. That's why many of us run to the mountains with our fishing rod and throw the string in the water to see if we can catch a fish.
Different things work for different people. There's numerous studies on, artistic expression and getting kids involved in different types of clubs and things. And so it really, there are things that can really help to mitigate the impact of ACEs. And then in adulthood too, what people find solace in. Some people find art to be, very great stress reliever. Others might be afraid to attempt to do art because they may feel, failing at it. And so it's really subjective. And for me, the bottom line is that we need to look and we need to develop very targeted interventions, identifying what's going to help that individual with their particular stress and triggers, and have an array of programs available to them that can help them. Lots of other questions here. Dorothy?
Dorothy Scotton. I think you have to unmute yourself, and then Dale Fletcher is next after.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Okay. I'm a big fan of the arts, and when I'm thinking about the arts, I think of creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And all throughout my career, I've used the arts in some way. Even if there's a businessman who comes, I'll put up a board and we'll draw his business plan. And I'm wondering if there can be more studies about making the transitions. Years ago, I did a study on people with dissociative disorder and preverbal trauma, and their unanimous feeling was that their process was a spiritual one of healing and integration, and that the arts in some form were instrumental in getting them there. So the arts became the bridge. And I think there's a lot of very down-to-earth strategies for being able to do that and make those connections. So I'm kind of excited about the work that you're doing, Jennifer, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dorothy. I think Dale is up next. Dale Fletcher, go ahead.
Thanks for the presentation, Jennifer. Are you familiar or whether or not anybody is collecting data or suggesting that ACE data be collected on perpetrators of mass gun shootings? You know, we talk about gun control and, you know, how do we correct this issue and stuff, but do you or any of your colleagues have influence at the national level, or are you aware whether they're considering collecting ACEs data on the people who commit mass shootings?
So they do extensive, they do extensive forensic studies, and so I'm sure that data is covered for individuals. When I say I'm sure, I don't know if they do a specific ACE screening on each one, but I do know oftentimes you'll hear that the individuals with mass shooting, I mean, there's a history of some types of abuse, especially bullying. Bullying is a risk factor, but there's a lot of research that's gone into that and looking at childhood, because kids that are, well, if you're looking at teenagers that are perpetrating mass violence, they really do go in depth into trying to understand the drivers of that.
Okay, thanks.
Donna Cooper, you're next.
Yeah, a similar question to the mass shooting. I was wondering about those in post-genocide or post-conflict situations, if there's a correlation in the developmental age of the exposure. Like I'm having in mind particularly those who've gone through the Rwanda genocide, if they were infants or young children or adolescent, if there's a difference in how they are functioning as adults.
So there is, and I'm not an expert on the specific pathways of the damage that happens, but I do know that the earlier in childhood that it happens is significant. Also, exposure to stress in utero is a significant factor. So, somebody asked about the biomarkers of toxic stress, and there are studies that they look at salivary interleukin-6, isoprostine. So there's different biomarkers. I know just looking at cortisol itself, that can change significantly throughout the day. So, but they're looking for biomarkers in terms of what they can pick up in children. Yeah. Beth, you had another question?
I did. Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you for sharing about a high ACE score yourself. I as well have one, and I think normalizing that across all of our providers and research is important. So thank you. I also want to ask, is Harvard doing any or Duke doing any of the study on psychedelics? I know that as it relates to moral injury, I know the military is doing the work, Johns Hopkins, etc. But curious if Harvard or Duke have any current active research on psychedelics healing from ACEs and moral injury.
Yeah, so I know that there was just a big conference. I didn't attend it, but some Harvard research has done it. My own personal, what I've seen is that now I'm doing work with Deepak Chopra and his team, and they've done investigative research in it, that it's a very temporary effect. And so an individual might have, almost like what I would call a state of grace for me, which was a spiritual thing. It's kind of like this, it's a momentary effect, and it's doing something neurologically, but in the long run, it's not a cure. So you got to do the work, and I think being aware and then the things that I have seen the best outcomes on a lot of the work on mindfulness and chanting and meditation seems to have some of the biggest effects. There just hasn't been enough research on religion and spirituality and ACEs and moral injury. We need to do it because in my own personal experience, that's been what's helped me the most. But it's very hard to get funding. We applied for several grants and didn't get to funding. So if you know people that want to fund it, let us know. Bill, you had your hand up.
Yeah, Bill Cayley, family physician in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And I just wanted to go back to the question around biomarkers. And I think it's an important area for research and probably for hypothesis generation. I would also want to have a healthy dose of skepticism in terms of thinking about biomarkers and how they apply to care for the people in front of us. Trauma and ACEs is something I don't know a whole lot about, but I do spend a lot of time thinking and practicing around primary care cardiology. And one of the things we've seen over the years is the more biomarkers we have, the more we measure them, and the more we pay attention to the biomarkers than to the what's going on clinically with the patient. I think it's important to try to understand mechanisms, but the more we think about biomarkers in relation to trauma, I'm afraid we're going to end up focusing on the markers and not the patient.
I think it's really wise. I think, yeah, I think it's really wise. I think the toxic stress that what you saw with the patient with psychosis, those are, I mean, that's showing what can happen, but there's many anatomical issues, including, it has an impact on the amygdala. So if children that are exposed to high levels of stress in utero, have smaller brains. I mean, there's just so many different mechanisms and points that it can be measured. And so really understanding trauma history is key. And again, California has mandated all primary care physicians who treat Medicaid patients, if they want reimbursement, they have to do an ACEs screening. The challenge with that is that they don't know what to do with that information, because they have insights now on what it is. And so now they have a record that the patient has it, but getting referrals to specialists is really challenging, because there's still a significant deficit in terms of the number of mental health professionals, and then mental health professionals that actually understand ACEs. And so the program, it's important to create awareness, but they don't have, it's like a typical unfunded mandate that, there aren't a lot of really good resources. And so now the primary care doctors are struggling with what to do and trying to figure out how to support one another when they get this overwhelming amount of information. Another challenge is the one study I did, they actually did in the Army through STARS. They did a study of new soldiers. They called it New Soldier Survey in 2010 and 11. And the questions and the way they asked them, they didn't use the ACEs survey tool. But if you ask a 17-year-old if they've ever been raped, especially if it's a male, they're not going to answer in the affirmative. All my research and doing the World Day shows that the average age of disclosure is 52. So it's a complex problem, and I'm looking at different ways to ask the question, in terms of trauma exposure, because it's very personal information you may not want to share with, a provider. And then there's legal issues, if the parents are still alive, or, if the abuser is still alive, does that become a mandatory reporting? So it's very complex, and, lots of work to do, but I think it's helpful the more people that are aware of this problem and doing research. So. Any other questions?
We have about 2 minutes. If anybody has questions, Jennifer, that's amazing. The average age of disclosure is 52. Is that true?
Sexual abuse, yeah, for sexual abuse. It was a study that was done on males, and it was they don't disclose. They just keep it hidden a long time. Yeah. I think that was aided a lot too by all of the public media about, the child sexual abuse. But yeah.
Rebecca Higman has a question.
Hey, Rebecca.
Hey, Jennifer. Thank you for your presentation. I had a question, and there were about, I know, as was said before, there were so many in the chat and out loud, so I just figured I'd lift it out. And one of the slides you had pointed out that often children don't have enough time to decompress between these adverse events. So I was curious more about what that decompression looks like. Does decompression just mean literal time in between, or are there other interventions that are supposed to happen? What does that ideally look like that they would have decompression?
This is time for play. This is time for exploration. This is time, to engage in in the loving relationship. So a typical experience for somebody who can't decompress is that if you have like somebody who has an alcohol or drug problem, and the child knows that on the weekends that it's going to be violent in the home, or there's going to be noise and stuff, they're going to be even stressed out all week long just anticipating that. And so not having the downtime, like we all experience tragedy in childhood, but it's that constant environment of fear and uncertainty that causes this ultimate toxic stress. And if you're really interested, the Center for Child Development at Harvard has done an amazing amount of research. So I just gave you highlights. I'm really interested in the moral injury part, but if you're interested, they have some amazing studies and talk about the decompression. They get much more detailed and specific. As I said, this was just very high level. There's a lot of really great research out there that you can explore.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay, we are at 1 o'clock, and
you,
so we'll
everyone.
have to close. This is such a fascinating subject. And we will definitely need Rebecca to come back and maybe have a second talk on this. So in any case, Jennifer, thank you so much for this presentation. Thank you all for your great questions, and we will see you next month.
Thanks, everyone.